So this seems to be a hot topic lately, and why is that? Because we live in a technological world of fast-paced technology and everybody expecting answers, and here, left and right, boom, right there you have it, instant gratification, right? You click on this, that happens, instant feedback loops. You expect of people to do certain things for you, and there's a lot of problems with that, but what's the hot topic here? It's the one world government idea, okay? This idea that a new world order is upon us. And now, here's the thing. A lot of people will think that a lot of people who do think this way about the new world order, or talking about how, yes, there could be plans for a world government and world currency and world religion, which we're going to get into, are crazy. But that's not necessarily the case, you see. This idea has been around for many, many years, hundreds of thousands of years, and there's even been past attempts, supposedly, perhaps. You look at the organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations and the United Nations. You look at those formations, why they were formed, and you see that, well, some people refer to them as the secret world government, but oftentimes what we can generally agree upon is there's a globalist state consisting of mainly statists, which you can pretty much 100% agree about. Now, the part that a lot of people have a lot of disputes about is Zionism, and comparing Israelis to Chinese when, let's be honest, they both have great influence, and Israel has a lot of influence for being a very small country. And then, looking at countries like Saudi Arabia, and Wahhabism is a whole nother ism word that we may get trapped into. But looking at all that, yes, they all influence, and they're foreign countries. So when we are building a world government, it is trying to control every government, and perhaps having a set of rulers to know what's happening, right? Taking over parts of land, right? What they call regime change, for example. What they say is peace and security, for example, is their motives to creating their, world government at most. And we see that also with the Greater Israel Project. We see, if you want to talk about Israel, we see the Greater Court of Mankind and the biblical prophecies and the Third Temple, and right? You see China, you see communism, right? You have a lot of different forms of control and a lot of history behind it that, as we know, history is not often learned from. But what I'm here to present is actually, well, what is this actually? What could be of this world currency? If we're going to look at the nature as to what constitutes a world government, it's having these other support structures in place. Having a religion, which is also a belief system. Having a currency, therefore everybody's dependent on one source, right? Not necessarily of income, but of one source of many different things. I mean, it could even be one supermarket, for example, that you go to, like Walmart or Amazon. So those are probably the most biggest I would see, per se. And there's a lot of historical writings and texts you can actually read from bloodlines themselves, because bloodlines is something that a lot of people can't disagree about. So while people want to talk about globalism, Zionism, statism, right, and how they all have a degree of influence, bloodlines at the roots often is the case. What else? Well, Satanism, not good, Luciferianism, whatever you want to call it. Right? I like to just call it evil, because that's what it is. And if it's an inverse of life, these foods are supposed to give us life. I see the same thing for the foods that aren't real. I see wrong foods, wrong people, very much evil, because they're not here to exist within nature intended. It was malformed out of nature. It is denatured. So that's the problem I see with the world, obviously, is the evil that is present and running amok and getting away with what they're doing, with not a lot of people holding them accountable, which, let's face it, that's what health coaches do when it comes to people's health. It's holding people accountable and saying, hey, well, there could be some evil present. Are we going to clear it out of our lives because we realize the importance of life? And do you know what life is because you've been deceived all this time into thinking this is what real food is and this is the food that will feed you? Right? It's asking those questions. And questioning everything, I always say, and questioning everything is what science brings. But then, perhaps that's a religion too. So let's get into it, right? Let's start with one religion, being that I'm on the subject. I said that religion is a belief system. So the very belief system in government is statism. Statism is going to have people stuck in all forms of belief in any form of government, period. They believe they need a ruler at all times. Now, I know that I'm covering some very sensitive topics. I get that. Very controversial. I understand. But these very controversial subjects you're not supposed to talk about are often the most important and often the ones that are used against you for agendas. And I'm pretty sure you can agree with that, is that these subjects, these topics, you don't agree with me, but they are used for power. I mean, you look at the history, we fought wars over religion. Okay? Now, a lot of what I could say, atheists will say, yeah, well, that you're saying exactly what I believe. No, I'm not an atheist just because I criticize religion and say that you shouldn't fall under one belief system or this or that. See, it's very ironic, but atheists are doing the very same thing that they're arguing against. But they refuse to see that because they still want to title themselves, don't they? Atheists are probably, to be honest, I agree with what Mark Passio says on this, because I looked it up after having many debates with friends and stuff, and it's like, I'm sorry, but you're literally unteachable. You won't even accept any knowledge, because you're so set in stone, like, I am an atheist, and that's it, and there's nothing else. But that's often the problem with religion, is having one set way of thinking, and then not accepting others, number one, and number two is just not really considering nature as anywhere part of it, despite it being a creation of said God or creator. Right? Creator is another general term that a lot of people can agree with. But if you say Jesus or this or that, now it gets more controversial just because you're naming somebody. I see. And I know there's some Bible quotes about that, like name my name and say my name and whatever. Very cool. I'm not against any of that. There's a lot of aspects to religion that I've talked about before. You can agree upon. The world can agree upon. It is universal. It's something that is undeniably true when actually looked into it, because it abides the natural law. But then there's a lot of aspects that don't, and then there's a lot of religions that change, and there's a lot of ways that you perceive religions differently, and they're interpreted different ways. So what am I getting at here? If there's a one religion, everybody's thinking the same way. Everybody has the same belief system, or a similar belief system, as to who to believe in, right? And so we see potentially, I will tell you the projection here, looking at Israeli influence, for example. And the third temple is a prophetic thing, the Antichrist, to unite all people under a one-world religion. That's just a perfect setup, isn't it, for a one-world religion? Now, other people want to say, well, that one-world religion is science. I think that will go hand in hand with that, don't you see? The physical world must crush the spiritual world in Satanism, which is considered a religion. So if they want to win with Satanism, with science, with atheism, and Antichrist ideologies, that's the basis to the one world religion. Okay? So whether you believe in the third temple thing or not, the other things still exist, and they all kind of abide to each other when you look into each one in depth too. And yeah, I will say, I've done a lot of the research on some of this. But I've also done a lot of observation. And I believe you can just keep an open mind to this information and say, well, yeah, science is left brain, atheism is left brain. A lot of these things are left brain, and if we become overly left brain dominant and we start thinking like science and statistics must prove everything in the world, then yeah, that's starting to become a religion, because we must use science to to do everything in our life and to constitute, and it's like, you're basically bowing down to science, saying everything must be this way. And Scientology too, right? It's another religion, but I'm talking about scientism, which is, kind of similar. Not really, but, there's so many different religions out there. There's so many different people out there. There's so many different perceptions. And having one in particular makes it pretty dangerous. Okay? It's not that it can't exist. There's always going to be bad people in the world. There's always going to be good people in the world. Right? I like to call it evil. I like to call it life. Well, there's always going to be some degree of both. I'm not asking for a perfect world here. In fact, I'm asking for the very opposite. Is that everybody is variant. Everybody has their own ideas here. And that does not mean we cannot unite and live peacefully among each other. I mean, don't you see? Actually, healing manifests when we realize this individuality. And the problem is they may use some New Age dogma, which you may say is the altered versions of natural law, or the obsessive use of meditation, or the obsessive use of crystals and stuff like that to heal yourself. Not that those things are bad. I support them. You know that. The problem is they may use that for their agendas, because they're going to use that, right? I mean, you already see mainstream companies making organic brands, like General Mills, for example, making Kashi or Canadian Farms to make it look like their food is healthy when it still has a lot of sugar, because organic does not necessarily mean nutritious. And I say that often, right? Because, I mean, I'm just an honest person. I'm not bought out by anybody. I'm not told to say anything in particular. I'm my own person in this life. And that's the problem, is when you're in a one world government and they're telling you what to say, and you believe everything you say that you hear on TV, you're already a statist. You start going toward their agenda. Let's say they want to expand Israel, and you think Israel's a great place. Now you're becoming a Zionist, right? Now, you think the government should have all this control. Now you're becoming a communist. Now you think science must prove everything. Now you're becoming a scientist. They can train your brain through the messages they're giving you through the television, unless you're an individual and unless you think for yourself. Because if you think for yourself, all that's already out of the picture. Your mind is vast. You're thinking, okay, I don't have to be restricted under any one of these. I can be my own person and look at all the aspects within them. Because clearly I still use science. I mean, I use studies all the time, right? Clearly I still criticize religion. Clearly I don't hate any Israelis. I love Jewish people. I love, everybody on earth. I think there's good and bad in everybody, right? But that's the problem. Is where we title ourselves and where we put ourselves, right? I mean, are you putting yourself in other people's shoes, or are you literally becoming their slave? I mean, there's a question to that too. So there's an irony to this great universe, and I've been talking about that for a while, right? So while you think one world order, one world currency, government, whatever, is a peaceful place, because that's how they will sell it, peace and security, as I mentioned before. While that sounds good, that's also, ironically, not in service to nature. So therefore, in the very nature, it is denatured. It is not something that you want part of your life. And anybody part of the truth community knows this. So I'm not going to harp on it. There's many great researchers on it, so I encourage you to check it out. But to be honest, I mean, really just think about it. Do you want to live in a world like that where everybody's under the same ideology? Where everybody's under the same thing to do? I mean, that kind of takes out the fun in a lot of things too. And if you think about the good old days when you would get away with doing this and get away with doing that, you can't do that anymore because they're watching you. We have a police surveillance state on our hands, and that's exactly what it is, especially moving into a tech age where world governance becomes easier and easier due to technology. Another reason why technology is so dangerous, okay? So I'm serious when I say this. I'm not trying to be paranoia. I'm not trying to... I mean, it's sad I had to make these disclaimers, but people will think things and they will turn off this video and they'll jump to different perceptions. And I just want people to think. That's it. I don't even want people to agree with me. I mean, that's my end goal. But because if you think for yourself already, everything that doesn't make sense out there in plain sight is gone. It won't manifest because nobody believes it. Nobody puts their time and effort into watching a corporate, controlled CNN propaganda machine, the idiot box, the TV. Wow, it's not the first time I cursed on this channel. I'm not limited to that either, but I was raised like that. I'm not going to curse. So anyways, that's one world religion, okay? Is all those aspects I mentioned, the atheism, scientism, okay, we got it. That's one world religion. Now let's see, what's next? One world currency, right? Because once you have the belief system set, we have currency, which is kind of a belief system within itself, because your perception literally shapes this entire world. But having this physical realm crush the spiritual realm, what is the actual physical thing that's often taking up most of this spiritual realm? Looking at all these dimensions too, that can help provide some insight. But money, currency is money, and looking at cryptocurrency, a lot of people suspect that will probably be the world currency. It literally looks quite obvious as day now. Look at reporters like No More News. He talks about how Israel's working on a cryptocurrency for the world, but China is too, frankly, and a lot of the big countries in the world, particularly, you're looking at the U.S. is always being used as a tool for world domination, the center of this world government. However, we see that a lot of governing places could be built within Israel, including the Supreme Court of Mankind, including, the ruling structures there, where the person sits and so forth, certain rituals that take place. And that's another thing with New Age, is they kind of take old age rituals and bring them into the new modern day, if you will. So it's not necessarily all that new, but that's just to say that sometimes we don't know what we're taking from our ancestors. We may be taking from our ancestors and think it's helpful, but just because we're learning from our ancestors does not mean our ancestors did everything perfectly. Again, nobody's perfect, and I think that we've never hit where we need to be as humanity, in all great honesty. While I may say, okay, well, back then was a nicer time in some degrees to some subjects I talk about, it doesn't mean back then was a perfect time, or back then was a time that I'd rather live in. Of course, if there was less government control, I'm going to be like, heck yeah, bring me back then. But there's nothing I can do about the past. The past is the past, that is the truth. And what we need to do is moving forward. And what we need to do is think for ourselves, because then everything crumbles apart. So if you have a one world currency, what does that mean? If you have food, you grow your own food, first of all, you're already contributing to a better economy, right? If you're supporting local farmers, you're supporting a local economy. But if you're buying from Amazon or buying from Walmart, these international giants, then yeah, you're going to be supporting a global economy. Now, if you're using paper money and not buying gold and silver, not that I am, but I'm just saying, this is from the Federal Reserve, which is basically a private owned entity, and it has, the president has no control over these guys. They admit it too, CEOs and everything. They talk about it extensively, where but they don't actually talk about it extensively. They only mention that, right? And they don't go on the public stage often at all, and obviously that causes conspiracy, but they're just not talked about because of their influence. Even Ron Paul ran a campaign called End the Fed for a reason. So it's something to look into for sure. But the Federal Reserve is, what helps handle this money here that we have in the U.S. And, they print money through a system called quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve is probably not the least corrupt in the system, because they are in charge of the money supply, so you're going to expect a lot of bankers, of which are connected to these bloodlines that we talk about, is what would be helping to rule this world, or having this obsession with war, which is a big part of it, to seize more land and gain more control, because the more control you have over everything, the easier it will be to control everything, right? So when there's a virus going down like the coronavirus, it's easy to say everybody go in lockdown because of the virus and everybody will believe it. And I'm not saying the virus is fake or anything. I think it's good to go in quarantine like that, but they're passing laws behind the scenes that aren't being reported on TV, and that gives them the perfect opportunity to gain control where people don't realize it, and they think that it's in their best interests. And that's the case of scenario every time the government steps in to do something. They cave in to people in their natural emotions to get done something that is completely denatured. And the only person that's going to speak up about that are people in the independent media, people like me who are like, wow, well, this is a violation of nature. What are we doing here, acting like God? Right? You want to talk religion? We are becoming the religion. We are becoming, the currency here. And that is the problem. Is it really the fruits of your labor, or are you really like using humans as slaves at this point? Because that's what it seems to be, and you even see in some of the Talmudic texts, there seems to be plans for that. But I encourage you to look into that for yourself. Yes, slavery still exists, and it exists in the biggest form that we know is statism, which is that belief in government. So people will have a hard time digesting even the simplest notions of this. No wonder why it will be easier and easier to control people, and why we keep getting in a greater, bigger state of disease and obesity and so forth. I mean, everything's just growing at the same time. And sometimes in very gradual amounts, so that way people don't notice what's happening. So especially when you have a virus becoming the big distraction, the big thing in the room, whether it may be the elephant in the room at times, there could be other things happening. There's many people on this earth, there's many governments on this earth, but there's several bloodlines that often control both sides to the war, for example. Like you see the Rothschilds would fund both sides to the war. Looking at Napoleon and the French Revolution, where the Bavarian plans were released and all sorts of stuff. I encourage you to check out if you want more info on kind of the Illuminati and what it means and what it actually means, not like conspiratorial terms. Look up Myron Foggin. He's like he was one of the youngest people to ever enter Hollywood, and later, toward the end of his life, he produced a recording that's now like 50 to 60 years old now, where he talks about the plans for the communists and Zionists to create this world government and divide people in order to conquer everything. And that's often the case. And when you look at war, right, it's a key aspect, because not only taking land, but dividing people, so that way they don't know which way to go, and they become more dependent on the government for their usage. So if the government's not telling people to prepare, not telling them to use nutrition, the people are going to be like, I need help, government. Where do I look? They're not going to know where to look. They don't have neighbors because they don't talk to them. They don't have self-sustainability, and it's too overwhelming to think about because they're worked up with their work, their job, which, because the economy is doing so bad, and that's part of the problem, is they want an economic collapse to further manifest this problem. There's a problem react solution formula to this, that they're waiting for certain things to happen so they can initiate certain things in order. Like, we know this. And this, again, it's very difficult to understand for somebody who's new to it, and it's like, what is going on here? Is this really a thing? And yeah, it's a thing. It's not really conspiracy. I'm not talking conspiracy. This is stuff that it's really in the books. It's in their own writings. It's in the proof. I mean, it's in the nature of technology. It's in the nature of law, of government. It's in the nature of what science seeks to do when it replaces religion, actual religious elements, and then what the nature of Satanism is to do, as we see in the star and what it represents, every side, with the bottom being ether, and in having the physical world crush the spiritual realm. It's in its own logo. But like, that's the crazy thing, and talking like that is abstract. It's away from nature. I mean, far, because you'd have to just believe me to go along with it, right? Because you've never been involved with this stuff. I've never been either. right? So we're taking somebody's word for it, somebody who's online, and how do we know we trust them? Well, how do we know? We have to make real-world observations ourselves, and so I do. I see that everybody's being dependent on certain sources for their health. Everybody's being dependent on certain stores for their food. Everybody isn't prepared for a virus. So what are they going to do? They're going to bow down. They're not going to know what to do. They're going to be dependent on other sources to get what they need. And that's just sad to me because it's a sign of weakness, a sign of lack of power. And that's exactly what sets in somebody controlling you, is their hold of power. They have power because you don't. You give it to them because you don't have power. You refuse to have power. You refuse to have willpower to stand up and for yourself and create more power for yourself. And learn not to use it against others, but bring others, with you up there. I mean, that's the thing, right? Bring people to enlightenment is all what it's about. A lot of this stuff was created in the Enlightenment era for a reason. You have light masons and dark masons. I believe in that idea that, you can use knowledge to bring people up. Just like how, knowledge is wisdom. Knowledge is also power, and power could be used righteously or it could be used for wrong. These are ancient quotes that should be noted, right, as wisdom for itself, knowledge that has been long-term, long-lasting, something that we know can be proven through time. So understanding that, if I take control of my life, I take control of my diet, there's no way that anybody can control my life when I have these tools set up and ready for myself, when I have the mindset already fostered for myself, when I built my life around self-sustainability instead of dependence on anything. And then guess what? You're less likely to have problems too, of any kind, from disease to not having enough of this, not having enough of that, or handling a difficult situation. You are ready. You are prepared. And they don't want that from you. I mean, they may say that, but they don't mean it genuinely. These people are not humans. If anything, they're psychopaths. And this is something to learn too, because a lot of people think that they're humans, and that's what keeps them believing in them. Okay, so all these factors play into it. I mentioned in the beginning it would be one religion, one currency, right? One political party, perhaps, because let's face it, the left and the right is one and the same when it comes to fundamentals. They're pro-war, they're pro-Federal Reserve. They won't criticize certain groups of people or certain institutions or certain families or certain pharmaceutical companies. I mean, it's just crazy, but that's just the world we live in, is one of control and obsessive control. But when you really take it down to a natural mindset, you think, okay, these guys are actually crazy for thinking they should rule over us. And why are we giving them that power anyways? Let's take control of our own lives and let's just live, our lives. And why are these people in our lives? Why can't we just have peace and love and freedom, as we are intended to do, instead of being stuck in these wars and conflicts that we ourselves created? But it's not just us, it's also the fault of the many people who believe. Because I hate to sit here as somebody who is more free-minded, I will admit, because I know I'm not part of the problem. I'm not saying it in an egotistical way, but I'm saying it because I know I'm not believing in this system. I'm not giving it more fire as fuel, but there's other people who will. There's people who will take positions and say, I'm a feminist, I'm a this, I'm a that. And there's people who will say, well, this is what has to happen, and this is what has to happen, and I'm sorry, but you're part of the problem. And there's people that will say, well, you have to vote, otherwise you don't have a voice. I'm sorry, you're also part of the problem. And unless you really think about it, unless you really, take the time out, I mean, these people that they have the control, these bloodlines, they've done this over hundreds of years, and they've plans have existed for hundreds of years. Look at Andrew Pike, a top Freemason. I mean, he predicted the world wars, and we may be underway with that as well. So you have to stay tuned with this stuff if you're really concerned about a world government. But you shouldn't concern yourself. You should position your life to where world governments cannot exist. And we need to get other people on board with that, so that way none of these things can even manifest, even if they were planned, okay? Because that's the problem, is their plans come together easily when people are just so susceptible and so vulnerable and so easygoing with their plans and not challenging the status quo, not challenging authority. So you got to take life into your personal hands. You can't blame the world for everything either. You can't keep looking externally. You need to start acting now within your own life and influencing the people around you right now. That's why I'm not afraid to make these messages, despite all the people I know in real life. And if they're listening, fantastic. But we need to create a ripple effect, a domino effect, where people can learn from other people as we are meant to do, not like robots, but as humans for once, which is also the problem with technology, is it's training us to be robots when we aren't. And understanding nature is understanding humans and understanding what we're supposed to do with one another. These simple little things. If we want to get closer to the truth, we're getting farther and farther from it by involving ourselves in denaturing forces like technology that seeks to destroy us, especially if it's programmed to do so, because it's manipulating our hardware, our system that's in our body. So unbelievable stuff to talk about, always to talk about, but there's always work to be done. And it's like, yeah, we need people out there to do it. We need people out there. It comes down to action, ultimately. I can talk forever about, there may be one world this, one world that. It doesn't matter. Because, again, none of this stuff can manifest if people take self-sustainability into their own hands, if people start taking steps into their own hands, like taking control of their health. That is a very top priority, especially if you live in America and you see the disease rates and you see that your mental health can improve through your diet, through nutrition. Yes, and that's one big part of it. Another exercise, another relationships, another community, it's basically the fundamentals to life that you are being drawn away from, because, again, divide and conquer, well, it's also manipulating you at every level of consciousness, every level of being. So that's what I mean when I say literally every part of and every structure of society is being denatured. It's everything. It's every little aspect, and that's where it becomes a very big problem, especially to me. It's not just one thing, it's everything that is being challenged, being questioned. You don't even know who to marry anymore. You don't even know who you are, what gender you are. You have to question these things. But yeah, it's because we live in this complex society where we are programmed to think like this, where we become to think like this, okay? So, is it controversial, the things that I'm saying? Are you upset about the things that I'm saying? Are you stuck on one way of thinking? You have to ask these questions. And again, it's actually okay if you disagree with me. It's actually just okay. Perfect. But can you disagree with the simple needs at hand, like having love, having friends, having family, having food, having water? But meanwhile, no, we need to build the next best phone. We got to make sure this phone is great. And make sure your car does this and car does that, because you need to be traveling long distances, right? Because that's very important, and you need to travel the world. It's so important because you need to see everything. And we need to make sure there's a new video game out and that it gets your attention all the time, and that you buy this and buy that. And that's something that you want too, right? Because that entertains you. It keeps you away from everything else going on in your life that is so difficult because you can't control it. And this is a system that is literally built around feeding itself. So will you actually feed your body with the foods that feed you? Will you actually feed your life with the things that will feed you, not deplete you, not feed off of you? Thank you very much. If you're interested in more, look into my poetical writings on this channel. A lot of the scripted videos that I did is basically the poetical and writing videos I did. I have a playlist on that on the channel. You can check that out. It's just, to me, it's more impactful about getting this message out in a smaller amount of time with much to to come from it in much fewer words, if you will, and that's the great part of poetry. But thank you very much for listening. This is Corey Edmund Engelot. Nature's the Answer. Is a world government just that? One religion, one currency, one belief system, one way of thinking? Well, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. It may be way more complex than that, but do we want to really think like that when our world can be farther simple? Because we've been living quite complex, and look where it's gotten us. And we've been thinking pretty dumb too, so quite ironic, isn't it? Thank you very much. Peace out.